This is episode 30 of Adventures in Supply Chain Podcast. We are pleased to present the Data and Tech in Supply Chain video series with guest John Ferraioli and host Marcia Williams. This episode is sponsored by USM Supply Chain. USM stands for Unstoppable, Scalable, Mindful Supply Chain. Check us out at usmsupplychain.com to scale up your profits together with your supply chain. Ask us about our free and live data-driven supply chain secrets masterclass. Our guest, John Ferraioli, is an enterprise software and consulting leader who sits at the intersection of data and analytics and the digital supply chain. He focuses on optimizing digital supply chain networks, actionable insights, and helping clients meet their business goals. Over the course of his career, he has been the data leader of Deloitte Consulting's Digital Supply Networks offering and helped develop the digital core solution to enable digital threads and transformation. At SAP, he led the global launch of SAP's Master Data and Enterprise Information Management solutions and has over 20 years' experience helping companies optimize their supply chain digital operations across life science, CPG, and MFG industries. John is a featured speaker and author for Digital Transformation, Digital Supply Networks, Data Management and Analytics, and we welcome him today with your host, Marcia.
Good morning, John. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to have you on one of the first episodes of this video series. So welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here, Marcia.
Perfect. And we heard the introduction by Ryan, but it would be great if you could please give us a brief introduction of yourself.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So, good morning. I'm John Ferraioli. I've been working around data analytics and insights, driving supply chain outcomes for the greater part of 20 years. And what I've found is in a very complex world, there are very, very real world challenges, and operationally, analytically, and at the heart of that, when I think about solving complex problems, I'm always looking to what's the root cause. And when it comes to insights, 9 times out of 10, it's the data. And the data drives the process or enables the process and ultimately the analytics. So I tend to focus a lot on enabling digital supply networks via data integrity, analytics, and the ability to tie these things together for greater outcomes.
Wow, that's great. And today data is being compared to the new oil. So
yes.
it's so important. And John, what data we should have right in supply chain? What is the fundamental data that we need to get it right?
So I think it's always based on the use case that you're going to be trying to solve for. And when you think about an end-to-end digital supply network, a lot of times it's not only internal, but external parties working together seamlessly to meet the goals of the business and the consumer market. So it's important to dissect the data, to your point, to the foundational, fundamental data that's necessary. Not all the data. Lord knows we can get it. But the question is, how are you going to apply it? So a simple way to look at getting the right data is to process decompose. So if you're trying to optimize, for example, spend analytics, right? Global spend, well, you're really going to need to find out, because there's plenty of algorithms and plenty of analytic capabilities to derive that answer. The question is, what are you deriving from? So you should have a good foundation of who are your suppliers, what are your categories, what are the materials or services that you're procuring, and then how do you define them in a consistent way? Because you might have one plant that calls something a pulley in an MRO spare, right, for maintaining the plant, and another one might be called a sheave in another location. Well, if you're buying the same thing called 2 different things for 2 different prices, it's hard to achieve that ultimate spend analytic, optimized procurement, optimized supply chain goals. So process decompose down to the data layer of the most important, the key data elements that are most critical for the outcomes. And then you can, once you have that foundation, build and expand on that for additional insights.
Great, great. I see. So it's like we need to have the outcome in mind, and then go backwards and understand what data we need. And I also like your point that is our company, but also the different participants in the supply chain. So we need their help, and great the point about that one plant may be calling something different than other plant, and it's the same item, like with the part numbers. That is so common, right? That we have different part numbers for the same item.
That's
Great
right.
example.
And that notion of how people identify or classify, right, their components or their suppliers, right? Is a supplier, considered Coca-Cola, or the Coca-Cola company, or Coke, or Coca-Cola? And for any company, you can abbreviate, right? Hewlett-Packard,
Yes.
Hewlett-Packard, HPE, H.P.E. So those types of examples where people are trying to get the information into a system so that they can ultimately execute a process and get the job done often becomes compromised because the data is in different formats or in different representations, and that ultimately compromises the analysis and the business process down the line. And what we tend to see is that, the root cause problem to supply chain insight is more often than not the business data that's being created, managed, and the life cycle, right?
Yes.
So it's so important to look at this holistically, but make it easy, right, for the business to engage, because you don't want to just be continually cleaning data. You want to set a policy, right? Set a standard, and then everyone can say, this part is called this, right? Versus we call it whatever we want, and we buy 5 of them for 5 different prices from 5 different places.
Yes, great. And I'm sure, like in your experience, right? For example, when there are these projects that initially we can do a big cleanup, let's say that we are going to implement an ERP system. So we do the cleanup like you were mentioning, but then it's very important, as you indicated, to keep that data updated, correct?
That's right. 100%. And think of it this way. Almost anything that you put into use is going to be degraded over time. So everybody gets dressed and they put on a nice or clean shirt, we hope in the morning, maybe with COVID, not so much all the time. But you put on a nice clean shirt, and then, if you used it and wear it and are active, it's going to get dirty. And it's the same thing with data. The more data is touched and reviewed and updated, the more the data has an opportunity to degrade. And they have analysis on this. So getting data clean is easy, right? But keeping data clean, keeping it operational, having it designed for analytics, so it's consumable, right? So it can be valid and then give you the right insight that you can then take action against. Well, that's a process onto itself. So a lot of times when we talk about the notion of data, it's get it clean. But once you get it clean, a lot of the policies and rules and the opinions, right? Do we call it a pulley? Do we call it a sheave? Once you lock in and say, we're going to call it a pulley, right? That becomes a rule. And that rule can be enforced via automation and by technology to keep that data consistent so that you keep it clean. And then there's ways to measure data and look at it and analyze it so that the standards and rules that you once agreed to, right, when you did the beginning cleansing project, can be instantiated and can be made to be complete and enforceable in an ongoing process. And that really makes it easy for the supply chain community to invest early, but then to reap the benefits over time. And I think that's a really important part, is that we need the business, we need the people involved in the supply chain to be actively engaged on determining the standard, the rules, the policies, that work best for the company. And then that way you can automate and use technology to get the data clean and then to keep the data clean. So that's the continuation that we need to enforce, and it makes everybody's life easier. And that's how you get people involved. You don't want to make it difficult. You want to make it easier for them to engage.
Yes. And along those lines, to keep them engaged and that they continue with this process that it has many challenges.
Right.
Where do they start? Like, for example, if an organization wants to become more data-driven, they want to have a more data-driven supply chain, where can they find the low-hanging fruit in a way?
Well, the good part is, that's a great question, because no one wants to focus on, unless data people, but nobody really wants to focus on what's the canonical data model or what's the new data schema or what have you. What they want are business outcomes. And in a lot of experiences, supply chain rolls through either operations or finance. And the CFO might say, okay, I want you to go out and better optimize inventory, because carrying costs on inventory is quite dramatic, right? It's anywhere between 8% to 22. And if you're in the airline or defense industries, it's even higher, right?
Yes.
So managing inventory is a critical intersection of cost and balance and just in time. A lot of moving parts and a lot of parts that you're paying for that may be sitting on the shelf.
Yes.
So inventory optimization is one supply chain centric example where it's important to understand what's my consumption. And you have all these historical ways of understanding, how many spare parts do you require on hand? Now, the procurement side of that is what we said. If you call the same spare part 5 different things at 5 different plants, they might source from multiple different suppliers and try to get the best deal. But it's often a case of the opportunity to do intercompany trading of spares is lost.
Yes.
The opportunity to have global spend tied to inventory is lost. And the inventory optimization numbers, now that we have streams of new data coming in from predictive maintenance and IoT and asset intelligence, is something that, opens the aperture much wider relative to the true nature of how much inventory do we require on hand. But ultimately, you need to classify that and say, which are the parts, which are the spares, which are the materials I need on hand, so that I can have better insights and predictability in my consumption, and then extend that not only by managing the best level numbers of inventory, but then you help out your supply chain colleagues around the procurement side, because you can say, well, who's the best supplier or who's the best provider of these services? And then where do we store them, right? From a logistics perspective. So the notion of how do you get people involved, I see it as a digital supply network, right? Versus a chain, versus siloed operations. How can each other focus areas within the supply network benefit by sharing and exchanging? So think of it this way: the inventory optimization team can help the procurement team, and the procurement team can help the logistics and distribution team, right? Or intercompany trading of spares. And interestingly enough, you can also help the CFO by saying, well, we're going to also, by better managing our inventory and our suppliers, our strategic sourcers, we're going to be disruptive to fraud and money laundering, right? Because we're not going to be paying the same vendor twice, right? Because we have a single view of the supplier, and we can buy at best price. So you're helping multiple organizations, right? But you have to start somewhere. And then what happens, again, in the notion of rather a siloed supply chain or a linear supply chain, it's now digital, end to end, right? Full visibility, and the relationships, the entity relationships between procurement and inventory and distribution and manufacturing, or going back to R&D. Really, really critical to tie these things together. And the key can be data. And demand planning has to be responsive to the markets. And there's variables on historic sales that you can use and say, well, this is my baseline and this is how we've always seen the market, and we get a little spike because there's an event in town. But when you look at the ability in these marketplaces, right, to tap into new data sources, in addition to the traditional internal data sources, right, looking at your trading partners, your ecosystem, your supply networks. Now there's new information sources. It could be weather. So we talked a little bit about what's happening in Texas right now in southern states with the cold and the grid. Mm-hmm. Well, this is going to affect demand planning if you're a food distributor, right?
Yes.
Because maybe people aren't going out to restaurants as much given the crisis that's happening, right? So there's a way to incorporate real-time data, right? Mm-hmm. And this is socioeconomic factors. There are unemployment numbers that are coming in. There are weather conditions. There are COVID health and wellness considerations that all are sources of data, right? From third-party marketplaces that can come into in many examples, a cloud data warehouse. And then this data can be incorporated as key data elements. So earlier we talked about, a spare part or a material master or something of that nature, or a key supplier. Well, now you have the ability to add third-party data into your decision. So the aperture gets larger, right? The lens gets more focused on what are the contributing elements and compounds associated with your decision-making. And so the data lens gets larger, but it's important to have the right data for the use case, right?
Yes.
So that your demand planning can affect not only your distribution strategies, but ultimately what's my restocking? What's my inventory levels going forward? What's my demand generation? What are my sales strategies going to be in a particular market that is, in one case, perhaps depressed, where unemployment numbers are going up and people may not be going out to restaurants as much, or because of the weather, right? A natural disaster. And so that you make these adjustments, this notion of this resilient supply chain, right? And being able to be adaptive can take in new data sources, real time, always on, and give you the types of insights that you can make these decisions that affect not only demand planning, but the whole digital supply network, from inventory to replenishment to sales strategies to discount management. And one notion begets another. And that's really the true power of how data and information can help these digital supply networks become more dynamic, more resilient, more responsive, more effective. And that's really, the promise of it all.
Yes, excellent example with demand planning. And as you were saying, we need to get to the root causes, because there we go to the source of the data. It's not like, as you were mentioning, John, it's not only to say, okay, let's take the sales last year, and then we make some adjustment to that. Is to go to the factors that will have an impact. It's like when we do a promotion, right? It's those we need to go deep into the data. And as you were explaining with the example in Texas, that is completely different, and they will need to monitor how the weather is going to be. It's critical.
And there's an amazing array of technologies, right? Analytic and cognitive capabilities to leverage in this data decision making, this data-driven supply chain, right? This information supply chain, so that you can have, assisted or supportive analytics, right? That will allow you to say not what did happen, right? But what perhaps is going to happen, or a prediction. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, again, they're tools. Right? We have this capability. If you ask Siri a question, well, it's the same notion, right? That can be extended into digital supply networks to better analyze the data, to make predictions against the data, to run, use case and algorithms against the data sets, right? And to learn, to make the adjustments along the way. And again, tap into external data sources, right? Socioeconomic, weather related, catastrophe related, environmental, and so many others, right? To open up the aperture, to get better insights, and then ultimately, better supply chain decisions.
Yes, no, that's so true, because typically or traditionally we have purchasing, operations, and logistics. And logistics take care of transportation, warehousing, but there's no clear connection. And that is how we miss opportunities.
100%.
So,
And if somebody has 100 pulleys at one location and they're looking for a sheave in their ERP system or MRP in the other, they're not going to find it. But if they identify this is the same part called two different things, and now we unify that view, now you can say, oh, let me distribute my extra inventory from one plant to another, and then you have a plant view, so you can accommodate for the financial transfers internally. But it's certainly better than having double the amount of inventory now sitting on two different shelves and consuming that viable working capital, right?
yes.
Because operating and working capital is key, clearly, across supply chain and manufacturing. So it's one way to solve one problem that then solves many problems, and it's repurposed. It's not just a one-time thing. So it really helps open the eyes of, now that we solved for this problem, right? How do we go on to the next challenge? What are your most critical and compelling business cases? And then once you identify the data for the business case and the process and who are the people, tie all those things together, right? Then you can have a repeatable model for becoming digital, right? Or extending your digital capabilities.
Yes.
Make sense?
Yes, perfect sense. Great. And so would your recommendation be to start analyzing the data with the different functions, focusing on inventory optimization, and then look at different technologies to keep that data, to keep that data right, to be maintained over time? Is that right, John?
I think it's always, to your point, what is the business case, right? What are we solving for?
Yes.
Solve for X. Now, once you understand the parameters of what you're trying to solve for, then you can look back into the core or key data elements, the most fundamental data that you need to execute that process. And it could be in any ERP system or any cloud-based environment workflows.
Yes.
And when looking at the data and analyzing it, right? Somebody in supply chain, they've got work to do.
Yes.
And that work is quite draining and quite engaging. So to do data analysis, you need to make it easy for them to consume and visualize and understand, versus looking at millions of rows on a spreadsheet, right? Because if you think about spares, MRO spares, it's not uncommon to have 400, 500, a million spare parts. So you can't go through these spreadsheets. So visualization is key. Now, what's important to say is, what does good look like? If I know that I need a common definition of one of my suppliers, and if your supplier is, if you're in automotive and your supplier is Borg Warner, right? Is it BW? Is it B-W? Is it Borg Warner? Is it fully spelled out as Borg, abbreviated BRG? On and on and on and on. Well, I need a single view of that supplier, and I need to understand other versions of that, which are considered duplicates. Now, if you tell a data person, let's do this, they're all on board because they know the value. You tell a supply chain person, they're going to say, look, I just need to get the part at that location and at this time so we can do our build and make our run. So you have to have that alignment across what's the problem we're solving. Why should you get involved in the first place? Because if I have a common view of my supplier or my materials or my vendors, my customer, right, my locations, then the workload for planning, scheduling, procurement, manufacture, distribution becomes more easily adaptable, more easily resilient, more easily to execute, because you have a common set to execute against. And when we talk about analyzing data, I'm a big fan, but you have to analyze against what? What does
Yes.
good look like, right?
Yes,
How many
yes.
duplicates are acceptable? What's the consistency of the data? What's the base unit of measure, right?
Yes, yes.
And what's the interior versus exterior diameter? And so all of these variables, right, of how you classify, how you categorize your category management, right, need to be identified, because as you know, if you think of abstractly common example, you say, what is let's go buy a car. Well, am I going to buy a Tesla, or am I going to buy
Yes.
a car from the junkyard? They're both cars. So
Yeah.
specification and details from the procurement organization of what they want, what they require to execute and get their job done, right?
Yes.
Helps procurement, that helps manufacturer, because you could always buy a cheaper grade of resin, for example, right? But the yield isn't as good, or the product quality isn't as good. So you could always buy something for less dollars. So specification management is super important. And that, or some of the things, the quality, the consistency, the conformity to a standard, the completeness of the data is what you can then analyze. Now you have a set to analyze, and you know what good looks like. So then you can go back to the business, to the supply chain leaders and operators, and say, we've identified that your ability to leverage spend is compromised. We've identified that your ability to make a quality product from this classified supplier doesn't meet your standard, right? Because the grade of aluminum isn't the same, or the grade of the chemical compound isn't the same, or the food quality. So all of these variables on what does good look like are your metrics and your standards and rules, and then you can actually measure against that. And the example, you can manage what you can measure, right?
Yes, no, that's perfectly right. There's so many great points. And when the organizations start doing this, what are the most common mistakes that you have seen?
Well, when you think about common mistakes, in the world of digital, everybody wants end-to-end visibility.
Yes.
Right? And they want it instantly on, always on.
Yeah.
And so the notion of exposing bad information that much faster, right? Or making poor decision everywhere in the world is capable, because the information can be distributed. The data and the information can be distributed and made available. The question is it valid? So the notion of starting small makes sense, right? Failing fast is something you may have heard, and a lot of people talk about fail fast. But because we've advanced so much in data specific to supply chain, specific to manufacturing, a lot of the use cases that used to be fail fast are now, hey, we've been doing this for years. Let's get to work. Let's engage in a pilot, right? We don't need all the data. Let's take a sample of the data, right?
Yes.
We don't need every category, right, of raw material. Why don't we just work on one category?
Yes.
And then get success, get the business buy-in, right? Demonstrably prove the outcome. We were able to save this much in procurement. We were able to make products faster, better throughput, better OEE, better performance, coming out the line, quality. All of those demonstrably proven things, right, support the business case, which then will drive, the opportunity to scale and tie things together. So instead of just doing digital, now you're being digital because it's ingrained in the process of saying, hey, I need data, I need process, I need information, I need insights, and I need action, right? So tying all these things together, data is one piece of the puzzle, but more often than not, it can be a big corrupter. So it's important to think about the big picture, the business outcome, the goals, and then process decompose down to the right data and the right context. You could always add more data later. There's no shortage of getting data. The question is, what do you do with it, right? And how is it relevant to the solving for X? That'd be best practice, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yes, like to start with some categories, show the value in the eyes of each function, as you were saying, and then to expand to others. And with that is a good way to build momentum. So that's great. And I remember one sentence that you mentioned at the beginning. Data is the interconnector of with the different functions. So
Sure.
I really like that. So if we have that right, we can do, yes, we can accomplish the goals for the organization. And at the same time, it helps to be aligned, right? I like how you were saying for each of the functions, how they can see that, how they can see the objective, what they get. So that's great.
One comment, I worked with a very large global agribusiness and in food company, and they had major objectives across the supply chain.
Mhm.
And when you drove into things like procurement, it wasn't just, what inventory and where do we store it and how do we trade it across intercompany, but it was also a liability to the CFO, right? What are my payment terms on my
Yes.
suppliers, and who are my most trusted suppliers, and are they legitimate in where I'm getting the product from a compliance and regulatory? So you can have wins not only for the original issue of, how do I source, or how do I procure, or how do I, manage inventory, but one notion begets another, and you start looking at, fraud and money laundering. You're not paying the same vendor twice.
Yes.
What are my payment terms? What is the liability of the company? And then this company was massive, so they had billions of dollars of liability for their payment terms. And if the payment terms was net 30 for somebody else, and we're going to pay somebody else net 90 days, they had hundreds of examples of this. And so the visibility of how much cash do I need on hand to pay my suppliers, right? And my days payable outstanding, which is a key metric under finance. So supply chain better enabled finance, got finance's support, which then spurned more investment and more value creation that everyone benefits. And that's truly a notion of how supply chain not only can help their own discipline, but so many related organizations and operational groups across the company working holistically.
Yes, no, that's great. And I really like that example about cash flows with the invoices to avoid duplication of invoices, the payment terms. Another example could be when the suppliers send the invoices late. So then finance find out that, okay, we need to pay all of this amount.
Right.
And so there are issues with that. So yes, finance.
And there are just hundreds of examples of disruptions. Now, again, every consultant out there, and I'm one of them, but they'll talk about, look, you need to be resilient, you need to be sustainable, you need to be all the right words. But the reality is there are disruptions that happen, and that there are heroic actions by people in supply chain, right?
Yes.
Who get the job done amidst all the chaos around them, right? And so what we're talking about is ultimately, finding the leverage point to make this, true digital, resilient, sustainable supply chain, all the right buzzwords. But you're talking about making people's jobs easier, because if you order the wrong product from one of your suppliers, the classic you see, right? So because their description is wrong, right? Or your description is off, or the unit of measure is off. You get the wrong product at the wrong location, right? With the wrong tax ID, the invoice isn't paid, there's disruption, and then you're sourcing from somebody else at a priority, and they're saying, well, just send it as quickly as you can. I'll pay the difference. And from doing this type of work, and then, working with so many, clients who, we develop relationships with, it's ultimately about how do we make everybody's life a lot easier, right? And so you can't be digital without data, but from a supply chain perspective, You can't optimize your supply chain processes. You cannot if the data is dragging you down.
Yeah.
Right? It just can't happen.
Yeah.
You can work around it, and a lot of people do on spreadsheets and other different heroic deeds, but it's not worth the aggravation. We're trying to make people's lives easier so they can do the real critical work, right?
Yes.
For the market, yeah.
Yes, and to the point about having multiple spreadsheets around, that is a very common situation, unfortunately, is more challenging to implement what you mentioned, to have standards, right, so the data can be maintained properly, because if we have multiple sources, then at the end, we don't know.
That's right. And functionally, it may be the same type of product, right? I mean, I have a pen and I have another pen, right?
Yes.
But the weight of this is different. The application of this is different. The capabilities are different. They're still pens, or they're still a material. The question is, what is the specification behind it that I'm going to procure at the right price, at the right location, with the right quantities, right? That will give me greater recipe yield if I'm a CPG manufacturer. Or if I'm a industrial manufacturer, will I get the same level of quality out of this grade of steel or that grade of steel? Or if I'm in life sciences, right? What are the quality control measures that are being considered, right? Or how do I make sure that I have the right compounds, right, at the right level of integrity? All of these things are very, very critical, and it ultimately not only affects supply chain process, but it will affect your insights, right? Your actionable insights, your ability to make a difference. And the analytics tools are abundant in the marketplace today, as everyone knows, but they need to be coupled together around what's the process, what's the right data, right? And again, there's oceans of libraries and marketplaces that can be tapped into with cloud data warehouses, really, really impressive things.
Yes.
To open the aperture on the information and the data that you're analyzing to help you better with your supply chain. And so it's not a shortage of data, right? It's how do we put it in context to the problem you're trying to solve, and then use the right tools so that supply chains can be, in fact, resilient and responsive and able to execute at scale. Right? Those are the types of amazing opportunities that are out there today in supply chain.
Yes, and John, thank you so much for all the insights, because what I like is that it is actionable, right? We discuss how we can use the data, and that those results, they can be seen in the P&L, and also they can be seen in our daily lives, because it's going to be easier, the work that we perform. So thank you so much. And what is the best way to reach you?
Oh, okay. So cell phone is great, right? Send me a text, 631-902-4572. Or my email is jaferry, F as in Foxtrot, ERRI 154@gmail.com.
Perfect. Thank you very much, because you can help many companies. So thank you for being here and for sharing again your valuable insight. So thank you so much.
Marcia, thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, John. Such a great episode. We have learned about data and how we can have that data actionable to drive decisions in supply chain. So once again, thank you so much, John, for having joined this episode. And next week, you will have another great episode talking about data and tech in supply chain. And also in March, we will have a bootcamp coming up that is Data Power Supply Chain Bootcamp. So stay tuned for that as well. See you next week.